Guys, welcome. I'm so happy to be talking to you. This today is our last session together for the module of kids ministry. You learned that I see kids as teenagers and children from primary school and babies. So I'm always considering all ages under 18, and today that's especially important because we're focusing on child protection and GDPR. I'm not an expert on any of that, but I do like to be informed, and I am trained to be a child protection officer, so I will walk you through that later on in the second part of today's lesson. For the first part of today's lesson, I invited to join me my good friend Sarah Legge, who is very smart, and she knows loads of stuff. Second, she's extremely organized and detail-oriented person, so we'll try to manage that today a bit. And third, she works in a legal section, so for the GDPR she got trainings and she can share her experience and how to implement the best practice for our local churches in the light of kids ministry. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you for having me, Patricia.
Thank you for joining. I feel absolutely privileged and rescued at the same time. I would like to be talking about GDPR. Even the name freaks me out.
A lot of people say that, so
yes,
that's
I
understandable.
never remember if it's GDPR or DGPR. I always make this mistake. So anyway, we'll try to get it right today. And guys, don't be worried. That's not an official proper training. That's just an introduction. It's just to make everybody aware what it is, and maybe to like it a bit, you know, to make the monster a bit smaller and work for us. So Sarah, what is GDPR and why it's important for churches?
Excellent question, very good place to start. We'll try and make this less scary and less complicated and less overwhelming as a subject like this can feel can be for so many people. And legitimately so, because there is so much to it. But let's start with the basics. So back in 2018, you may have received a ton of emails or maybe correspondence from people like your bank, maybe a solicitor if you have one, different third parties that you would tend to give your personal information to. And there was a lot of correspondence out to people in that period of time, just letting people know that there was an introduction of a new European law.
Right, so it's quite new.
Yes, only 2.5 years old at this point, and people are still getting to grips with what that really means for their businesses or their charities or churches indeed as well. So relatively new, yes. So this GDPR essentially stands for General Data Protection Regulation, and that replaces previous laws that were in place for protecting people's data. There's now an awful lot more public awareness of the need to protect data. And there's also a lot more privacy in place for people's personal data, which is obviously a really good thing, that we are protected and safe. Most of us give our information very easily to companies maybe like your bank, maybe like a medical expert or a legal advisor, or even a government body, say revenue or somebody like that. And we tend to not think too much about handing over a lot of that personal information. This regulation in particular makes sure that you and I have an assurance from the government or from the law that our personal data is safe, that it's held securely, and that it's being used in a responsible, acceptable way. And the people that we hand them over to, say a bank, or as I say, maybe a government body, or also possibly a church, these parties are known in this law as data controllers, and essentially these people have a greater responsibility on them now than they had before in terms of what they have to do with this data. And as I say, the individual has more strengthened rights in this area. Now, if you've been in church for any length of time like I have, and I know you have, it's hard to imagine sometimes why we need this, because church is like family, right? We love each other, we know each other.
That's what comes to mind, the trust, and what kind of information we would have, which would be so sensitive to have the law built around it.
Exactly, we're like a family, right? And that's the way church should be. That's very important that we think that way. Nevertheless, it's important for us to understand that in the eyes of the law, if you are a church, the church is set up usually, not always, but usually as a registered charity.
Right.
And even if it's not, a church, like any other organization, is handling personal data on behalf of people. For example, the most obvious thing in a church would be the members of your congregation, or perhaps your leadership. And certainly in the context of kids ministry, you have kids enrolled into your ministry, you have corresponding with parents or guardians regarding permission and all this kind of thing. So no matter what ministry we're talking about, churches are now in a position where these principles apply to them just as much as it would apply to maybe the large conglomerate international organizations we think of, like Google and whoever else, that they are responsible for our data. But actually churches are also responsible for implementing best practice in terms of how they handle that information on behalf of other people. One of the greatest challenges to realize in that respect is that whether it's electronic information or paper information, all of that data needs to be responsibly used and stored. And we'll get into a little bit of that later. But specifically, because we're a church, that covers the area of religious identification. For example, you and I identify as Christians, people who love Christ. And even under this category of data, or under this data regulation, that particular information is known as sensitive data or special category, which means it's something personal that identifies me that could also be used against me. And therefore, something like my political beliefs or my Christian stance or whatever beliefs I have, or whether it's genetic data, that information particularly needs to be guarded and secured even more than what we would call normal data.
Right, so does this mean that a person who comes to church, they need to be assured that this is not any way told somewhere else? Does this mean that? So coming to church, you need to feel protected, that even if you are here, your presence and your beliefs and your values in life are only for you to be shared with the public.
Exactly. This is the kind of thing that this data protection has brought in to make sure that the rights of the individual to keep that information private are strengthened, and that any information you hand over to your pastor or your ministry leader or whoever it is, even as a parent, just signing it over to the person who checks in your child into the ministry setting, whatever it is, the key message for churches is essentially to protect the privacy of those people who are using that ministry or a part of that church, and that the churches consider the risk, essentially, that's the big key message for churches, considering the risk of what if that data was lost or put in the wrong hands or misappropriated in any way, and to think like that in terms of how we use the information that we've been given from people.
I see. Okay, that's not scary. That's okay. We're still doing fine. So my second question, can you give us some practical examples of what not to do in churches which comes to GDPR?
Yeah, excellent question, because sometimes we have a harder time understanding what we should do, and sometimes to help us with that we can look at examples of what not to do, and sometimes that can help us see clearer.
Right. And probably I need to hear your examples, but probably it goes against what we used to do.
Yeah, often that's true, especially I think in a church environment. Again, as I say, it can be a place where we let our guard down, where we can be very relaxed, and obviously that's something we want to foster, an atmosphere of protection and safety and being relaxed with people. But I think sometimes in church we can be guilty of doing very simple, very innocent things, or maybe we've done it in the past like that and it's always been acceptable. Now, under these particular regulations, because of people's strengthened right to privacy under law, churches need to be very careful not to violate that privacy, even in very, very simple, very innocent ways that we can go about how we use the data. I'll give you a practical example. Say, for example, you have a creche ministry or something related to the under preschool sort of age, where children are being checked in and checked out by parents and being looked after obviously by staff or volunteers in your church setting. So in that scenario, most of you probably have a system or are trying to develop a system of notifying that parent, maybe if little Johnny, for example, needs his mom for whatever reason, and they need to alert that parent to come to the child assistant. How do you communicate that? You need to consider how you protect the privacy of the child and the family involved while still getting the message across that the mother is needed.
Yes. So can I disturb you here? So we're going to the stage and we're saying little Johnny O'Brien needs his mommy because his nappy is dirty.
That would be very much what not to do. The poor mother, for a start.
Yes, we need to
poor Johnny.
Take care of the whole family.
Or father. We don't know who's going to go for little Johnny. But very, very practically. And sometimes in small churches as well, or if we're new to this environment, sometimes we can just think, well, what's
the big deal? Yes, we know Johnny and Johnny is one, so
we love Johnny.
Yes,
there's no problem there. But actually, we need to consider how the duty that's on the church to protect the rights of these individuals, even to the fact that the name of the child, even that much information needs to be protected. So a very practical way of handling that sort of system is having, whether it's a digital registration system or some sort of a software-based system where you check in and out children through software, and that gives you, rather than a person's name, it gives you a code, or perhaps maybe if you don't have resources to do that, not every church does, you can make that a simpler operation with numbering, for example. And then when little Johnny needs assistance, the relevant code or relevant number is what is put up on the screen, and the parent knows that's my child because they're identified by the number. A system like that also protects the child in terms of access. So whoever checks that person in, they are the only person who is allowed to check that child out as well, because they have to present the code they were given. So these are practical ways of protecting that child. Another basic example, which is very, very easily done, is if, for example, you are in a ministry setting like Kids and you are sending out information to parents, you might have a bulk email set up for all of the parents and guardians on your database. And when sending out a bulk email, for example, it's very important for privacy, again, not to have all of those email addresses in the to section, but that we hide those in the BCC setting, the blind copy, setting up an email so that you only see the email that's addressed to you, and you don't see the 25 or 250 other parents that are also getting this email. That actually can be a breach of the data for people.
And guys, I've done it a few times, and that was a mistake. Thankfully, an email address is not like an actual address of the person or even a phone number. It's less risk, but it's still the data which needs to be protected, because it's up to the person if the person wants 200 other people seeing their email address. Maybe they don't.
Correct. And we need to assume that people don't want this stuff put out to other people, rather than assuming that people do just because they're in a church setting. And it's also very easy when you are handling emails, and I know this has come up in my line of work, where perhaps I'm emailing Johnny's father, and instead of writing Sam Smith at Yahoo, I might accidentally, or if it had a misspelling or something like that, or leaving a digit out, or even putting a dot in where there shouldn't be, that could go to another legitimate email address for a person who's nothing to do with this individual. So details really do count when it comes to protecting and keeping people's information safe.
So we're presuming that people wanted to share this information only with us, only with me, dealing with kids' information for the parent. And we're presuming that this information is not to be shared unless the owner of the information shares it with somebody else.
Exactly, and that's up to them to do that, but it's not up to us as a third party.
Yes, so we're not offering everybody's data, everybody's this information to everybody else only because we come to church and we know each other.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly.
I see. That's really a shift, isn't it?
Yeah, it's new thinking. It's new thinking for a lot of churches and for a lot of organizations as well. This has changed a lot about how people do business as well. And it's very important. Obviously, as individuals, we can really see the benefits. We are more protected. Our information is more protected. And again, breaches of data are taken very, very seriously because of that strengthened right to the individual. So it's very important we just keep our eye on the ball in terms of loving the people that we're entrusted with as well, those children, those parents, those families, those guardians. This is a way that we can show them that we are a safe place and that their information is protected as an extension of the love and the care that we want to show those people.
Right, right. And that's a very practical way and legal
Yes.
way, and an obligation which we have how we're loving people.
Yes, exactly.
That's really good. That's really good. Thank you, Sarah. Some practical examples of where to start and how to organize GDPR in churches. Can you give us some?
Okay. This can be a huge area. It can feel very overwhelming. And I totally understand that people do feel like it's very difficult to organize and it's difficult to get your head around. Where do I even start? Especially if this is brand new information and you've maybe never dealt with this before. So I would recommend starting off by essentially becoming aware first.
Oh, yeah.
Churches are not exempt from this law, as we've already established. So it's very important that we get educated. It's very important that we start at the basics and just look up whether it's training courses, training your people if you are in charge of a team or you are any kind of responsibility in your ministry. It's important that you get your people trained as well as yourself. There's plenty of online information that you can access, and we'll give you a little bit of that later, but to do your research. And there's also a lot of misinformation out of there as well in terms of what is right and what is wrong. So for your own particular circumstance, it's important to put in the time and get educated on it.
So let me ask here, just to be clear, we're not training the whole church, right? We're not preaching about GDPR and the rules we're going to go by. So who are we actually training, or what is the group of people who needs to be aware in our local church?
Well, certainly any staff member or any volunteer in ministry should do their due diligence and find out what that means for their context. It will change depending on what your role is and what sort of responsibility you hold. Now, churches, generally speaking, should appoint a person or maybe a group of people or a couple of people, whatever it is for your own context, to start the work on data protection in your own context, because everybody's context is different. There's more work to do in a larger church, obviously, because you might have more departments and you might have a little bit more data on your databases. But essentially, until somebody takes the lead, there is real risk of non-compliance or something going wrong or data being breached in some innocent way, usually. So it is best practice to have a data protection officer in place.
Good.
It's not actually required for a lot of churches. It would depend on the scale, again, of the data that you're handling. Probably the mega churches may possibly need to have that. It's not a legal requirement here, but again, it's best practice. It would be a sense of having someone who is someone who's going to take the lead, someone who's going to spearhead the information campaign of getting people trained and pulling the information in and getting people on board with it and making people aware. Because compliance, as a general rule, is a very ongoing matter. You need regular checks, you need regular monitoring of how you're doing and what you're doing. It's a good idea to run things like internal audits within your church as to how you're collecting your data and what you're doing with it and all of those things. So I would recommend appointing a particular person to handle and at least start the process if you haven't done it already.
Right. Perfect. That's a good start.
Just further on that, I would suggest once you have an appointed person or you have people who are going to do this for you, to start with the data audit. So let's go back to Johnny, right? Little Johnny, we have his name usually, his date of birth, his address, his parents' regular contact information. But possibly you also may have, because he is a child who checks into your system, you may have medical conditions for him, or allergens or anything like that.
Important.
You may have health-related information outside of that. You also need to consider the data that you hold for your own people. So your own volunteers, your ministry directors, your staff, your volunteers. And then your child protection information, which is a vast subject all on its own. So one very important recommendation is really to document everything that you have and to examine the information that you have, how you got it and who it's being shared with, and do a little bit of an inventory, a little bit of an exploration. Okay, what are we going to do with the data that we have? There are 7 key principles that we need to examine data under. We won't go into a lot of detail, but essentially those 7 key principles for data protection are, first of all, lawfulness and transparency. In other words, make sure you tell people what information is needed from them and what it's going to be used for. Why do you need it? That's very important. Purpose limitation. Why do you have that information? What exact purpose are you attaching to that? Which is known as legitimate use. Essentially, you need a good reason to have that information. Data minimizing. Do we really need the data that we have? Have we over-collected? Have we taken in way too much on that person, or is it all strictly needed? Only collect the information that you strictly need. Accuracy, is it correct? We talked about email addresses maybe being incorrect, or having a dot where there shouldn't have been, or vice versa. Has that information been changed? Has someone moved house and updated their address or changed their phone number? Storage limitation. How long do you keep that information is important. And I think for churches, we can tend to sometimes roll on year after year, and we still have the same database we had 15 years ago.
That might be correct.
That would be an important thing to just highlight, that these things need to be monitored and refreshed every so often, and check, do we still need to keep that information? Because there are limitations to how long you're supposed to hold on to information. Integrity. Again, it's a security thing. How is it being recorded? Where do you store it? Who has access to that information? How easy is it to get to? If someone were to try and illegitimately try and get to that information, how easy was it for them to do? And accountability. Essentially, are we making people's data safe? Are we protecting people's privacy? And do you ever need to share that information with a third party? For example, if you had a legal right upon you when you became aware that a child was in an abusive situation, or I don't know, there was a risk to that child's safety, do you have an obligation to pass on data to a third party in that incident? So questions like that are quite important for you to realise. And essentially to adopt what we call a risk-based approach. Trying to think ahead and say, if this information was breached, what damage or what loss could it cause to the person who owns the information? Could that be harmful to them? Could it be used against them? And to pay particular attention to that. And the last thing I would just encourage you to do in terms of starting off, especially if this is a brand new thing, is to consider just drafting policies for best practice. Start writing down how you're going to handle situations or what you're going to do. What procedures have you already have? Are your team aware of these? And have they been trained in following these? Do they understand the expectations maybe that you have? And if you are working with staff or volunteers, what expectations do we have on them in terms of how they handle data? For example, anything that they have access to that they won't misuse or spill out or pass on to another person or go gossip about over the tea station or whatever it happens to be, that there is an agreement and an understanding in place that that is confidential information. And the very last thing, which is very important, is the idea of consent. We talked about the fact that churches have often just opted on the sense of, we assume people want to share information with us and with everybody else as well. So now really consent is a huge thing. We must assume that people don't want us to share that information. Consent, as far as GDPR is concerned, needs to be really, really clear and very well set out for people, that they have an opportunity to say, I'm opting in, for example, to receive your newsletter from the church kids ministry or whatever it happens to be that we're sending out, and that they have the right to withdraw or not to give you that information. So for example, if you have a parent on your list and they haven't been around in 6 to 9 months, you need to know that you have expressed clear consent given from that person to contact you. And if they have come back to you to say, I don't consent, that information needs to be removed from your records. And child's consent obviously then as well, under the age of 16, as far as this particular rule is concerned, you need a parental or a guardian's consent on the child's behalf.
Right.
So just to be thinking ahead in terms of having the right consents in place for those children.
Wow. So we're not displaying the names of all children who won the prize of the last competition for our light party on the door.
I certainly wouldn't put it on the door, or maybe not even in an email.
Yes, yes.
Once it's written down, usually you're entering a whole different era of, or a whole different sphere of how that information can be used in a way that we would not be happy, and that person would not be happy with it.
Yes.
So yeah, wouldn't recommend that.
Wow, that is really a shift from going, we're both in ministry and churches over 20 years. So I remember my home church when I first started going, and obviously the phone numbers were passed on, and you just say, oh, go to Mary, she helps you with that, and she lives there and she gives you a lift, without asking Mary, because we presumed that she was so much a Christian.
Yeah, exactly.
she would like to help us. Now we're thinking, okay, this person is holding on to their personal information, and we need to protect the information as much as we want to protect the safety of the person who is visiting us. And we need to make the owner actually owning and responsible for sharing their information. So in a sense, we are possessing their belonging. That's how I'm picturing it. It's like they would handle us something very precious to them, and we need to take care of it.
Absolutely,
basically.
and especially in the area of kids ministry, where you're talking about minors and you're talking about vulnerable persons.
Absolutely.
It's extremely important to show best practice and to do everything that we can. And we may not be there yet, we may not have it all sorted out, or we may be just starting this journey. But to be able to say, right, this is something we're committed to doing, we're going to protect, we're going to keep these children safe. We're going to allow the parents also to feel safe in this environment by being very transparent about how we do things and to try and do them to the best of our ability. As I said before, to show love and care and concern for those people. And sometimes those people are not people we know 20 years. They may be brand new to the church, maybe they're not Christians, maybe they're just checking it out because they've heard great things about kids ministry, or they know someone who's been and they're checking you out. But there is always that sense of the parent also needs to feel safe with handing over their child, and part of that is their child's information. So yeah, that's an important part of why we need to do it this way.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. Sarah is so good to give us a list of different websites where we can go for further information. Obviously, there are organizations who train for that, specific roles and specific practices. We don't have to be professionals in everything, but we need to look for someone who is and who can help us and guide us. Thank you so much. It was such a joy to have you over, and just all this detailed information, your knowledge to share it with us. That I'm very grateful for that. Guys, we're going to meet probably in my kitchen again for the second part of this lesson. We're going to bring this back to child protection, and I'm going to walk you through the best practice of that aspect in the ministry. So thank you for joining us for this part, and I'll see you soon.